One thing about me is I don't really love to speak on things that I'm not an expert on, because I'm not really an expert on much, but I don't like to speak on things unless I've had like a really good amount of experience or time to really think about it and wrap my mind around it. Another thing about me is I was recently sick and I'm attempting to record this even though my voice is not fully back. I hope that doesn't drive you crazy. And the third thing about me is I got bangs. But going back to the first thing about me, the reason I say that is because I spent the last year, all of 2023, and I will continue this mission into 2024, but I spent a lot of the time focusing on my word of the year, which was community. And I spent that year focusing on what that word meant, why it was important, and I feel that this year, now that I've spent a full year focusing in on it, figuring out what it means, what value it can bring to my life, my community, today I'm going to share one of the big concepts that my year of focusing on community taught me, which is that capitalism/consumerism keeps us lonely. It benefits, that system benefits from us being disconnected, lonely, and individualistic. I have so many thoughts on the intersection of community and consumerism that I'm gonna make so many more videos about it. So hit the subscribe button if you're new here, or if you're not new here and you forgot to hit the button before. So let's rewind back to about 2021, because I think that's when this realization really started to hit me. I would say up until 2021, I knew that like contacting my representatives was important, right? When elections came up, I voted. I contacted my representatives when I happened to hear of something being passed that I thought was important where I lived, those sort of things. That was regular for me. But I would say other than that, I was a very individualistic, perfectionist environmentalist. I focused very much on sustainability being about what I could do today, right now, that is tangible, that can help in a positive way towards the environment. But in 2021, we had a Texas winter storm. The Texas winter storm that left us without power in my cul-de-sac for 4 full days, and then 2 days prior to that of it being off and on. It taught me a lot about our structure. Our societal structure is so flawed, and how I really wasn't connected to my community because I didn't have to be. So when the Texas winter storm happened, okay, and we all lost power, some of us needed to go to the grocery store to get food, but some of us drove cars that it didn't really make sense for us to be the one to go because we drove like lighter weight cars. It was just more dangerous for us. But some of us drove cars that it made more sense for that person to get the orders of what people needed from the grocery store and go get it for us. For me, the way this actually started is I wanted to make chili and needed diced tomatoes or something, I don't know. And I remember going and asking one of my neighbors, and they gave me their diced tomatoes, which seems like such a minimal, small thing. But I think prior to that, I hadn't really realized that like when you're in community together and you care about each other and you work together, you don't necessarily always need to be the person running out to the grocery store buying something, if that makes sense. It will make sense as the video goes on. But anyway, some of them had electric stoves so they couldn't cook, while we had a gas stove so people could come and use our stove. Some people had gas fireplaces, others had wood, and I needed a key for my fireplace that I didn't have, and I realized I need to ask someone a couple streets over to borrow theirs. That just really woke me up to how disconnected we were. This system that we live under leaves us disconnected. Why is that? And what would life look like if we actively worked against that? So I started to explore this idea of community. I put on that lens of what I learned from the Texas winter storm, of what I knew of like environmental movements depending on intersectionality, community activism, and all those sort of things. And one of the things I started to realize through this process was that our disconnectedness also made it to where we didn't really care about our neighbors, that we were all kind of low-key in competition with each other at all times. And for the people on the street that like don't have homes, don't have clothes, don't have food, for some reason our society has built this like look at them as if they are the problem, as if their inability to live under a structure where we have to trade our time in for money to be able to eat to survive. It's a moral failing somehow on that individual, not the system, if they didn't play the game right and they're on the street. I also around this time started to live in a more urban community, and so I was starting to see people a lot more. I live in a walkable, bikeable neighborhood now. There are unhoused communities in my neighborhood now. And so I started to learn more about like what connectedness could mean and how the disconnectedness leads to people who have enough having way more than they need, while the people down the street are literally struggling to survive. And making these connections started making me realize how that same like line of logic aligns itself with environmentalism, sustainability, climate change, because especially living here in Texas, if you live in like a modern home, you are able to kind of survive the summers here with air conditioning and not pay too much attention to what it might be like for those people who can't afford to run their AC all year, who can't afford to replace their AC, who don't have a home. And it becomes easy to disconnect the impacts that climate change is going to have on everyone, on our communities, if you are sitting in your air-conditioned home and you are disconnected from the people who are already suffering from climate change. And that's just the example for here in Texas and what we're going to experience, which will definitely be extreme heat. But when we continue to be so disconnected, it becomes harder and harder to relate to the people that our actions across the world are impacting. And so obviously, as we are that disconnected from not only the environment, but each other, it started to make more sense to me why people don't feel the need to change their actions, why they don't think climate change is a big deal, why they're not more serious about changing the structure, the culture, the system, and your own lifestyle at the end of the day. So I'm having all these realizations, and essentially what I realize is, well, I need to connect with more people. I need to talk to more people. I need to actually be a member of my community. I need to get involved. And listen, I have social anxiety. I've talked about that a lot on this channel, and I still do, but I do think that over time, what I would call exposure therapy over the last year of really focusing on being a member of a community has helped me a lot. I'm just gonna call it exposure therapy, because putting myself in more situations to prove that the world is not going to end if someone doesn't want to talk to me, if they don't like me, if I stand awkwardly next to people without anyone to talk to, I will survive it. Every population in the US especially is suffering from a loneliness pandemic, and studies have shown that human connection is as important to our health as food and water. So I convinced myself I needed to push past it. Exposure therapy helped a lot, but I also actively last year, like one of my biggest focuses in therapy was not necessarily specifically social anxiety, but more specifically convincing myself that not everybody hates me. I have this weird thing where I think that everyone I talk to hates me. In order to interact with more people, to be in community, I can't walk into every situation thinking everybody hates me. And so that was a big focus for me in therapy last year, which helped a lot with, all of this. I welcome you to set intentions for yourself in therapy. And if you're not already in therapy, you might want to check out the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp, because they can help connect you with many, many therapists all across the country. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, but when BetterHelp reached out to sponsor, I was like, this is the exact video that it makes so much sense to talk about you guys with, because of the impacts of our mental health from loneliness, but also how much my therapist really did guide me through getting to become part of community. Those things are so interconnected for me. And BetterHelp helps make therapy so much more accessible. And when I say accessible, I don't just mean like you can do it anywhere. They also have different ways that you can do it, right? So voice calls, messaging, video calls, you can do it in all sorts of different ways. And they will help connect you with over 30,000 different therapists to help find you exactly the perfect one for your specific needs and preferences. And it's super easy. You can just go fill out their form that's going to ask you what you're looking for in a therapist, maybe what you're struggling with. And in most cases, they'll be able to match you with a therapist within 48 hours, which if you've ever tried to look for a therapist, let me tell you, it's a very time-intensive process. So this really helps make it simple. And another way that I think BetterHelp is really helpful, because again, I've been in therapy for many, many years, and sometimes you find a therapist that you just don't jive with. I've personally, let me tell you something. Let me tell you a little insider. I've had a couples therapist once. Madison and I went to couples therapy years ago. And one of the issues I think we were talking about was like how to split household labor, because we were both working full time. We're both women. And so that dynamic was very interesting. And this therapist, who was like a little bit older, suggested we start using paper plates as a means of helping lessen the labor. Needless to say, we need to switch therapists. And when you're using BetterHelp, it's super easy to switch therapists if something like that happens. If they just don't really understand you, you can switch. So if you are interested, you can join the over 4 million people who have used BetterHelp, and you'll not only be supporting yourself and your mental health, but also this channel. And if you use the link at the top of my description, you can get 10% off of your first month. So my only hope at this point is that you understand why community even became a thing of focus for me, why I felt connected connected to it, called to it, those sort of things, because I feel like when we talk about these experiences from a personal level, it helps people understand and connect with the deeper message. And there's so many thoughts I have around all things tangentially related to community, but my goal was just to help you understand why I became interested in it all of a sudden, because obviously my content was focused a lot kind of through one lens, and I'm shifting it to a different lens, and I want you to understand why. Like I said, there have been studies that have shown that human connection is as important to our health as clean air and water. But then I want to move into the problems that exist outside of those things, basically the alternatives to being in community, and why it's a problem, and why it's really deeply rooted in our society. So let me use an Instagram post of mine as an example of why I think people don't fully understand what this is. I did the ins and outs of 2024. Would love if you shared yours. This was honestly my favorite trend of the last couple months. Reading people's ins and outs was so fun for me, and it was fun for me to come up with my own. I don't know. I just love intention setting in the first quarter of the year. So if you have a list of ins and outs, please drop them in the comments. The reason I'm bringing this up is because one of the things I put as an out is individualism. And I think it probably makes sense, just the word community and individualism, how those are like in stark contrast to each other. But when I wrote this, someone actually commented like, what is individualism? What is bad about individualism? Someone also commented that they were working to have more individualism in their life, specifically because they're a mom and they've lost their sense of self, which I totally get. An example of individualism is always wanting to show how cool you are, or how cool the things you can do are. And that doesn't mean that the things that you do and the unique skills that you have are bad, but it's the showing off and wanting to stand out from your community. It's the look at this cool thing I was able to buy, or this accolade I was able to achieve. Individualism is when I am posing a criticism of our current economic structure because someone in my family is deeply, I don't know what the word you would say. They have some issues with their health, their mental health, their physical health, and they're not capable of necessarily being a typical functioning member of our society the way that we expect an individual to be a part of it. And so I was criticizing our economic system for that reason. And another person at the table said, well, when I was working, it worked for me. That is individualism. The individualism of, well, our economic system worked for me. So obviously, if you just work harder, it'll work for you too. I do think in the environmental movement, and I've definitely been guilty of this, individualism is guilting someone for their single plastic cup and ignoring the fact that our like overall culture and society values convenience over all else. And so it makes sense in our culture that we would look towards single-use plastic, and because it's convenient for me, and ignore the way that that single-use plastic harms so many, not only environments and animals, plants, the greenhouse gas emissions, and ignoring all of that because it is convenient to you is individualism. It's also tied to that phrase, keeping up with the Joneses, right? This idea that your family unit needs to be like up to standard and stand out and do their part. And the nuclear family in and of itself is also a byproduct of individualism. It's the person down the street who waters their yard to keep their grass green in a drought and ignores how that impacts the greater community. In each of these examples, and like literally thousands and thousands of more that we could come up with, like every scenario that happens to you in your daily life, if you start looking at them through a lens that is community focused or solidarity focused or focused on resistance to the culture that we all live under currently, you will start to make very different decisions than if you look at all of your decisions through this individualistic lens. And that's kind of the shift, the big shift I've had over the last year. And so my question is, when you look at the world and the decisions you make and the lifestyle that you live through the community lens, and it's obviously overall better for the entire world and doesn't take a lot away from your own life, how did we get to a society where we are looking at all of these decisions through such individualistic lenses? And you guessed it, on this channel, with me talking, the answer is consumerism. So I think to find when this became a serious problem, we go back to around the time of World War II, because the economic boom of that time led to much higher levels of consumerism than pre-World War II. families started to have a lot more disposable income. So this meant for the first time, many families were now able to buy so many different things: home goods, fashion, cars, even homes. The new ability to buy bigger and better than your neighbor led to a lot of materialism and competitiveness. And I think this time in history is also very significant for understanding how our communities are set up, like physically. So if you think about the fact that because people had more disposable income, a lot more people started buying automobiles, as they would say back then, but cars. And so that made it so that the person's average ability and where they would support became so much greater, right? When you get the ability to use a car, well, suddenly your options to buy things becomes so much bigger. But it also meant that since people could drive, they didn't have to create resources based on where like your target demographic was. And I think that's also why we start to see a lot of the resources that we would want in our neighborhoods, like our grocery stores, our coffee shops, veterinary clinics, are not necessarily based on where the people are, because now they didn't necessarily have to worry about that because now people have cars. So now we have much more urban sprawl, and we start to see so many issues with that. We start to see so many issues with roads getting bigger and trees getting taken down and the environment just being destroyed because people had more disposable income. So we started building societies around cars. But do you know what else happens when we start building societies around cars and using cars as our means of transportation? Well, we're no longer walking past our neighbors. We're no longer building community just by knowing who is in our community because we don't see them because they're driving by in cars. Around this time, because people who had disposable incomes were buying automobiles, mass transit, public transit became stigmatized. And so you wouldn't be seeing people on public transit because you don't want to be caught on public transit because that's for poor people. Ew. But I would dare to say that this is like a big part of why the middle class, or people who think they're middle class in the US, kind of see themselves as separate from working class poor or unhoused people, see themselves as morally superior, and they don't understand that they are so much closer to ending up in that situation than they are to ever ending up in the owning class. And I think that kind of disrupts a lot of our ability to understand that these people are part of our community, and these people are they've got a totally different lifestyle, community structure going on up here. And I think that further leads to more disconnect and more competition and more individualism because of the culture that happened when people were able to amass things and looking down on those who couldn't. But I digress. I'll also say during this time, I think we saw a big shift from multifamily being kind of normal, where you stay in your house longer. And now we have this kind of culture that almost demands that we move out at the age of 18. Like in the US, especially for people who are not people of color, people who are white, the idea that you stay at home past the age of 18 is kind of seen as you being a failure. That only leads to more consumerism, right? So now you need to amass all of these things to show that you're better than everybody. And you're gonna need your own car because now our societies are built to where you're not gonna be able to get anywhere without one. And now as soon as you turn 18, you need to move your things out of this house where you had plenty of room to live. You've been living in this space for 18 years, and you need to go get another house, which just leads to more consumerism, more homes being built. All of this, like, part of the culture of disconnectedness, disconnecting yourself from your family, disconnecting yourself from your community, disconnecting yourself from your neighbors walking on the street because of the cars and the houses and the moving and all these things. All of this disconnectedness has led to so much more consumerism, more houses, more cars, more things. And after World War II, we see a huge rise in consumer culture. We also see mass amounts of marketing and propaganda campaigns. Now you're more focused on what you're wearing in comparison to the person down the street. When I say you're keeping up with the Joneses and the consumer culture allows us to buy more to look cooler as an individual, that's things like decorations or clothing or those sort of things. But there are so many things that we own that we would not have to own and therefore would not have to be produced if we just weren't so individualistic. So I think I might have even made a whole ass list on here that I wanted to read off to you guys. Because when I say individualism is consumerism, I genuinely mean that if we were living in communities where we shared things, where we knew our neighbors, where we weren't so disconnected and in this weird competition with each other and constantly driving by in huge hunks of metal and putting up fences to keep people out and avoiding people when they ring your doorbell, if we actively started looking at the decisions we're making through that community lens that we talked about, there would literally not need to be several industries, especially, okay, again, I made a list. Let's talk about these things. The most wealthy people, the owning class, the people who produce things, they're the biggest benefiters of us being separated. And it almost makes me feel, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it almost makes me feel like it was done on purpose. Because think about how many suitcases exist on your block. In the next 1,000 feet on either side of you, how many suitcases exist? How often do they get used? How many lawnmowers, if you live in suburban America, because of all the things we already talked about leading to suburban America, how many lawnmowers exist on your block? How many 8-foot ladders exist on my block? Think about how many cars are sitting on your street. Think about how many washers there are in the next 1,000 feet on either side of you. Think about party supplies, barbecues, vacuums, camping gear, exercise equipment, anything for recreational use, lawn chairs. Think about how many things we all have in our homes that at any moment are not being used, because at this moment I'm using my laptop, my microphone, and my camera, and everything else in this house is not being used. Now think about who benefits from us being disconnected and each and every one of us owning each and every one of those things. And it really will blow your mind when you start to think about how many things exist on this planet that just simply didn't need to if we just knew our neighbors. How much less would need to be produced, how much less energy would need to be made, how much fewer acres of rainforest and mountaintops and water resources would be polluted and communities would be destroyed if we literally just knew our neighbors. There is a whole class of people who benefit from us being lonely and keeping us separated and a little bit sad and scared of people. And there's a whole industry, it's called marketing, who has convinced us that when we have a problem or when we need and or want something, the best thing for us to do is to buy it. This is the individualistic lens that we're looking through. When we have a problem, we just buy something to fix it. And in this lens, where we focus on community and we get to know people around us and we build solidarity and we start to care about people around us and those sort of things, the focus really shifts. And I did focus this video on how consumerism makes us lonely, how when we need something, we buy it, and we now have no need to ever talk to anyone. Like between DoorDash, Amazon, and Lyft, we could never talk to a person again. There is a solution that you can pay for all of your problems because you're so lonely and disconnected. You need a ride to the airport? Why bother talking to anybody or making friends or knowing your neighbors when there's Lyft you can pay? And as a millennial with social anxiety, I get it. And I've been really happy that there are things that allow me to not have to talk to a human on a daily basis to order a coffee if I don't want to. But then again, I realized that one of the most beautiful things that's come out of my year of community is my barista at my local coffee shop knowing my name and my order. It's a hard thing to communicate, but because I've put myself out there so much in the last year, it's rare that I walk into a sustainability-focused event and don't know someone that I've met from a different sustainability-focused event. If I go to a trash cleanup, it is rare that there's not someone there who says my name because they saw me at a previous one. And that is the feeling of community. And that is the feeling of when someone needs something in my community, I can help them. Those feelings are feelings you can't get from consumerism. And I think that's another huge part of this, is that we've been convinced that we are in this not convinced, we absolutely are in a crisis of anxiety and depression. And I've experienced those things so much throughout my life. I still experience anxiety on a daily basis. Okay, don't get it twisted. We have been convinced as a culture that the answer when we're sad or depressed is consumerism, when in reality, a lot of these issues we're experiencing are because we are so disconnected and because we so deeply need friends and community and people that we know. We so desperately need and want to be connected that we should be focusing on that instead of consumerism. And that's why I tell you that walking into an event that aligns with your feelings and your beliefs and your values, and knowing people there and feeling a part of that community, that joy and feeling and happiness will never be replaced by something you can buy, no matter how much they try to convince us of that. We can start to shift our focus from that individualistic lens to the community lens. And for instance, like one of the easiest ways to do this is when you're making weekend plans, you're not looking individualistically like, what is the trendiest restaurant in town that we want to go eat at this weekend because it's cool. But if you shift the focus to community, and your weekend plans are no longer just about what would make you happy or look cool or would be cool, and instead it's, how can I help my community this weekend? Where is my community this weekend? Where can I volunteer? Where's a pop-up? Where's like a workshop that's going on? What are the events that are happening in my city where I can add to a community? Where's a trash cleanup? All these sort of things. With the community focus lens being that is what you're doing on the weekends, I think is a really great place to start. And then I think once you build the community of people who are interested in all of these things, or maybe you've shifted the minds of your neighbors over time to be interested in these sort of things as well, I think you'll find yourself in a pretty close to, the dream community without having to wait 10, 20, 30 years to build it. Does that make sense? And honestly, there are so many more thoughts here about how consumerism killed the third space or community spaces, which really could have fit well in this video, but I feel like I've already talked so much about how consumerism has killed creativity, all those sort of things. Like consumerism has really been the vein of my existence for so long, but I think that I've always looked at it through the lens of, well, I'm not gonna buy this thing because it's going to have XYZ impact on the environment. And while I still wholeheartedly feel that way, when I start looking at the same instance with a community lens, it's so much bigger of how we got here, and I want to talk more about it. So I hope this video was interesting to you. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. I also want to give a huge thank you to the sponsor of today's video, which is BetterHelp, which allowed me to sit here for nearly an hour. We'll see what this gets edited down to, talking to you about something that I'm really passionate about. You do have to forgive me a little bit because this is new to me, not the video essay format so much, but it is new to me to kind of talk about these bigger, broader topics that honestly are still pretty new to me, but I'm very passionate about them. And so I hope you find this interesting. And my overall goal with it is just to get you to look at life through maybe a different lens for the next week. Maybe that's a little challenge. Let me know how you do with it. And also to get you to start volunteering more and get more involved in your communities. And especially if you have eco-anxiety, I promise, if you just take maybe a month, maybe you don't take a whole year like I did, but maybe you take a month and dedicate your weekends to focusing on community, and let me know how you feel about it, because I think it will really, really help with your eco-anxiety. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, until next time, you cannot do all the good that the world needs, but the world needs all the good that you can do. Bye, guys.